So kids are bad at paying attention. Whether that's in the classroom, they have difficulties focusing on a single task, or at home, getting distracted, often by the smallest of things. And yet, at the same time, children often surprise us with how well they learn. My friend's mom told me this story about how one of her sons was practicing this poem every day after school in order to present at a talent show. She said her other son was in the room at the same time, but wasn't really paying attention. And she told me how her other son, so the one not practicing the poem, came up to her one day and recited it perfectly from start to finish. And whether that's a mom exaggerating a bit or a true story, I'm actually going to talk about some data today, drawing from psychology and neuroscience research, that suggests this may very well be true. In fact, what I'm going to talk about is how bad attention that kids have might actually be a very good thing for their learning. So, what is attention? I'm going to focus on a kind of attention called selective attention, which we can think of as a spotlight, which involves the enhanced processing of information that's relevant to our goals and to our tasks, and also the ability to filter out information that's irrelevant, so to tune out distractors. And selective attention is not something we're just born with, but that develops from childhood into adulthood. There's a whole bunch happening in the brain that's leading to this. What I want to focus on today is a region called the prefrontal cortex. And this is a region you might have heard of because it's one of the slowest to develop as we grow from children to adults. And this region is important for a lot, but it's important for selective attention in particular too. So how does selective attention and these differences in the brain shape what kids versus adults learn? So I ran studies where I had kids aged 7 to 9, as well as adults, come into the lab and do these experiments with different games where I manipulated attention in different ways, which I'll get into, and then measured how that affected learning differently in kids versus adults. So in this first experiment, this is what it looked like. The participants came into the lab, they played this game where they had to press a button when a picture appeared on screen. In other words, they had to pay attention to the pictures. And this looked something like this. So there was this slideshow of images. They just had to press a button every time one appeared. So here, the pictures are the focus of attention. And then we had this surprise game number 2, where we asked participants to name pictures as fast as they could. And this is how we measured learning. So let me just show you what this looks like. So participants saw something like this, and once they knew what it was, as quickly as possible, they had to shout it out. So snowman, for example. And what's critical is that some of these images we showed to them in the slideshow. So if they're faster at responding to those images, that means they learned them better. So if we look at the results comparing adults and kids, we can see that adults in purple, they showed a lot better learning of these pictures. That makes sense. We know adults are better at selective attention. But what we really were interested in is comparing this first experiment to the second experiment, where the pictures were no longer relevant, and instead, the participants had to focus on these yellow shapes. So we had participants come back to the lab, and these were a separate group of participants, and they played similar games with a twist. So they had to press a button every time a yellow shape on the screen repeated. And in other words, they had to ignore the pictures. So the pictures were no longer relevant to the task. And that looked something like this. So they had to press a button if that yellow shape repeated back to back. And this is a hard task to do. It involves really ignoring those pictures. And then we did that same learning game where we had them name a picture as fast as they could. And what we found in this experiment was very different than in the first one. In this experiment, we found that now kids showed slightly better learning than adults did. And this is really interesting because it's saying that kids are learning this unattended information better than adults. In other words, their attentional spotlight is more diffuse. And the part that I think was the coolest about this study is when we compare across experiments. So in that first experiment, when attention was directed to the photos versus when their attention was directed away from the pictures, you can see at adults, so in purple, there's this huge boost in learning when they're attending to the photos. They're able to use their attention to boost what they're learning about. But if we look at kids, there's actually no difference at all between how well they learned in these experiments. And this is really interesting because it's telling us that telling kids to pay attention is having no impact on how well they're learning that information. So we were really interested in what exactly is going on in the brain that could explain this. To answer this question, we used fMRI to measure participants' brain activity while they were playing these different types of games. And the first thing we found is that in these regions of prefrontal cortex here, the adults were activating these regions more than kids when paying attention to the images. That makes sense. Adults are using their prefrontal cortex, a region we know is important for attention, to boost their attention to that information. But we also went a step further and looked at this part of the brain that we know cares about these pictures. And what we did is we trained computer learning algorithms to try to guess whether a person was looking at a snowman or a couch that was on the screen. So I'll go into that. So on the y-axis here is I have how well the computer was able to guess what a person was looking at based on their brain activity alone. So if the computer does a good job guessing, this is all you need to know. If it does a good job guessing, that means the neurons in that part of the brain are doing a really good job at processing and learning that information. So I'm going to plot it for both the unattended in blue and the attended in red. And for adults, there was this huge boost in the computer's ability to guess when it was the focus of attention. But for kids, there was no difference at all. The computer is able to guess equally well in both conditions. And this is really interesting because it's saying that actual neurons in the kid's brain, they're treating attended and unattended information the same. So to summarize, kids and adults have different attentional spotlights, which is shaping what they're learning. And telling kids to pay attention doesn't seem to matter. Their brains are going to learn it just as well. And a metaphor we like to use is to describe kids as sponges. They're taking in all this information, absorbing this information, regardless of whether they're trying to or not. So what next? Well, one, I'd be really interested in seeing how this extends to more natural environments, like in the classroom, instead of just a lab testing room on a computer. So whether from preschools to college lecture halls. But for this last minute, I actually want to take a step back and ask a bigger question. Why? Why do kids have bad attention? Is it just by chance that the prefrontal cortex develops slow? Well, the current thought in the field is actually that having bad attention might actually be adaptive and a very useful thing for children's ability to learn. And this makes sense if we think about what it's like for a baby to enter the world. Everything is one great blooming, buzzing confusion. And what I mean by that is babies and kids, they don't know what to pay attention to yet. And they don't have categories or a way of organizing the world. So it's better just to take it all in. In other words, this bad attention could be why kids can learn so much so fast. And at the same time, kids are also more curious, exploratory, playful, open-minded, and all of these things can help them learn. So the next time you're around a kid and they're struggling to pay attention, cut them a bit of slack. They might be learning more than you think they are. Thank you so much, and thanks to my collaborators who helped with this research.